She was standing in the rubble of what used to be her childhood home when she first saw him. It was 1945, and Frankfurt was ash. He was American, a soldier from Nebraska, she would later learn, and he was holding a tin of peaches, just standing there in his uniform, offering fruit to a girl who hadn't eaten anything but turnips in 3 years. She didn't speak English. He didn't speak German. But in that moment, something shifted. Within 2 years, they would be married. By 1946, she was one of nearly 50,000 German women who had chosen to leave everything, their families, their language, their bombed-out nation, to follow American soldiers across an ocean to a country they'd been taught to hate. This is not a story most people know. History remembers the surrender, the trials, the monuments. But what it rarely whispers about are the women who fell in love in the ruins. Women who were taught their whole lives that Americans were the enemy, only to discover that the enemy had kind eyes and a voice that sounded like hope. The Germany of 1945 was a nation of ghosts and widows. The war had swallowed 5 million German soldiers. For every man in uniform, there were 3 women left behind, bereft, hungry, and utterly alone. The cities were pulverized. Berlin was a maze of rubble and skeletal buildings. Hamburg had been firebombed until there was nothing left but ash and memory. And into this broken landscape came the American army. They arrived like salvation. Whether you hated them or not, they had food, chocolate, cigarettes, coffee, things that hadn't existed in Germany for years. They drove trucks through streets where there were no cars. They wore clean uniforms on days when most Germans had patched the same clothes 100 times over. To a starving woman, a soldier offering a meal wasn't an occupier. He was a miracle. But it was more than hunger that made these women marry American soldiers. It was survival. It was the future. It was the fact that staying meant rebuilding a shattered nation with no men, no industry, and the weight of Nazi guilt pressing down like a stone. The American occupation began in the spring of 1945, and the officers made it very clear: no fraternization. Soldiers were forbidden from socializing with German women. There were rules, there were warnings, there were courts-martial threatened. But soldiers are young men, and young men see beauty even in ruins. And in a nation where women outnumbered men by nearly 2 to 1, loneliness was something that cut both ways. She remembered the first time she dared to speak to one. His name was Thomas. He was standing guard near the marketplace, and she had pretended to shop, though there was nothing to buy and no money to buy it with. He smiled at her. It was such a simple thing, a smile, that she had almost forgotten what one felt like. That smile was the first moment she allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't include rationing or ruin or the knowledge that her brothers might never come home. By 1946, the fraternization rules had begun to quietly dissolve. The military realized they couldn't hold back the tide. Soldiers and German women were falling in love. Not dramatically, not in the way Hollywood would later romanticize it, but in the patient, quiet way that happens when 2 people meet in the debris of a shattered world and recognize in each other a chance to start again. The women who married American soldiers were not collaborators, though many Germans whispered that about them. They were not traitors. They were girls, most of them barely 20, who had grown up under dictatorship, who had seen their cities bombed, who had been told what to think, what to believe, and what to dream. And then suddenly, a foreigner offered them something revolutionary: a choice. But the choice came with impossible weight. To marry an American soldier meant leaving Germany, possibly forever. It meant abandoning your mother, who might never survive the next winter. It meant saying goodbye to your sister, your brother, the street you grew up on. It meant getting on a ship and sailing toward a country you'd been raised to despise, to join a culture you didn't understand, to speak a language that felt foreign on your tongue. And yet they went, 50,000 of them. They got on the ships in the late 1940s, brides in borrowed dresses, clutching the few possessions they could carry. Many of them didn't speak English. Many of them had never seen the ocean. Some of them were seasick for the entire journey across the Atlantic. All of them were terrified. What drove these women to such enormous risk? The answer is simpler and more devastating than romance. It was desperation. A German woman in 1946 had almost no prospects. The nation was occupied. The economy was in freefall. There were no jobs for women, no housing, no future. Her family was fractured. Many of the men her age were dead or in prisoner of war camps. And even if they returned, Germany's future was written on rubble. An American soldier offered escape, but more than that, he offered normalcy. He offered a chance to have a home, a family, children who would grow up in a nation not haunted by war. He offered the possibility of being someone other than a victim, other than a survivor, other than a German woman waiting for her nation to rise again from ashes. The love was real for many of them. In the letters that survived, you can see it clearly. My dearest Margaret, I cannot wait to show you what home looks like. I cannot wait to wake up next to you and know that the war is really over. These were not strategic marriages. These were people who had looked across a chasm of history and hatred and found something human on the other side. But many marriages were also desperate arrangements. Girls who married soldiers they barely knew because staying meant starvation. Women who said yes because their mother was dying and an American wife could get food packages. Girls who accepted proposals because the alternative, rebuilding a life in post-war Germany with no prospects and no future, was unthinkable. The American government eventually granted these women something called war bride status. Between 1946 and 1952, over 150,000 European women married American soldiers, and nearly half of them were German. It was the largest immigration of women the United States had ever seen. Ships were literally designated to carry these brides across the Atlantic. Whole newspapers wrote about Operation War Bride. It was bureaucratized, systematized, and yet deeply, profoundly human. When the American wives arrived in places like Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and Iowa, they faced a world more foreign than they had imagined. The houses were enormous compared to German houses. There was food everywhere, more food than they had seen in a lifetime. But there was also silence, isolation, suburbs where every house looked the same and stretched on for miles. There were neighbors who spoke no German, who didn't understand why these women had married the enemy, who sometimes treated them with cold suspicion. One German war bride named Ingrid wrote home to her mother, "America is beautiful, but it is loud. Everything is so loud and so big. I am so small here. Sometimes I sit in the kitchen and I eat bread just to remind myself I'm real." She was 23 years old and 6,000 miles from everything she'd ever known, married to a man whose family spoke to her as though she were either deaf or stupid. The letters these women sent home to Germany are haunting documents of displacement. They tried to sound happy. Of course they did. What alternative did they have? But between the lines, you can read the loneliness. "I have learned to make American food," one woman wrote. "My husband says I am a good cook,
but it tastes like nothing. I miss Muti's bread. I miss the smell of the streets after rain. And yet, many of them thrived. They had children. They learned English. They built lives. Some became community leaders, artists, teachers. Some eventually went home to visit Germany and found that they no longer belonged there either. They existed in a strange limbo, too German for America, too American for Germany, but at least they had survived. At least their children would grow up in peace. The women who married American soldiers in those years right after the war were making a choice that was simultaneously an escape and a sacrifice. They were saying, "I will leave my country, my language, my past. I will trust this man. I will trust this future, because anything is better than waiting in the ruins for a nation to remember how to breathe." History doesn't usually count these women as part of the war story. They're not soldiers, they're not famous, they're not commemorated in monuments or textbooks, but they were part of the machinery of healing that came after 1945. Their marriages were not just romantic gestures, they were small acts of reconciliation between nations that had been mortal enemies. They were proof that even across the deepest divides, connection was possible. In the decades that followed, these war brides had to reckon with their own complicated legacies. Some faced prejudice from their own German families, who saw marriage to an American as a betrayal. Some were never fully accepted in America, even as they lived out their entire lives there. Some returned to Germany to find it transformed, modernized, rebuilt, a place they no longer recognized. But their children grew up American. Their grandchildren grew up American. And in the quiet of their later years, many of these women, now in their 80s and 90s, would reflect on those impossible choices they had made as girls in a bombed-out nation. "Would I do it again?" one former German war bride named Gerda was asked in an interview near the end of her life. She was 91, living in Denver with her family. She thought for a long moment. Then she said, "Yes and no. I lost my country, but I found my life. And in those days, after the war, I didn't know there could be a difference." The story of German women who married American soldiers in those years right after the war is a story about survival and sacrifice, about the way human connection can bridge even the most terrible divides. It's about girls who were brave enough or desperate enough to leave everything behind. It's about the cost of rebirth, the weight of memory, and the quiet courage it took to become someone new in a foreign land. These women were written out of most histories of World War II. They appear in the records only as statistics, 50,000 German brides. But in the letters they sent home, in the children they raised, in the quiet lives they built in small American towns, their story endured. A story about how even after the worst of humanity had done its worst, two people could still look across the wreckage and choose each other. And maybe that's what we need to remember most. Not the war, not the hatred, not the division, but this, that in the aftermath of catastrophe, connection was possible. That a German girl and an American boy who had been raised to believe the other was the enemy could find in each other something worth leaving everything for. That from the ashes of a broken world, new worlds could be built. The silence after war is profound, but in that silence there were voices, quiet voices, The voices of women who survived by choosing love, by choosing risk, by choosing to believe that tomorrow might be different from today. Those voices echoed across generations, and in the children and grandchildren they left behind, they still echo now.